All right, good morning. Thank you for being here and getting out and braving the rain and the wrecks. I think there are several of those going around, but that's all right. I'm glad you're here. I know some of you had a great long night last night, partying with folks from the Winchester Church. Miss Fran said if I can keep her awake this morning, I've done a good job, because she went and spent some time with folks from Winchester last night. I'm thankful they joined us for our meeting last night, and that some friendships got to spend some time together eating cake and things. Next time you do that, invite me. We'll come eat cake with you. If your Bibles are here, let's bring them to the book of Mark chapter 7 and Mark chapter 8 is where we are studying from this morning. We're going to kind of look at a few passages, a few words. In a sense, this lesson's a little bit more technical than some of the others, but I think there's a lot of application here. My mind always thinks about things from a different perspective, and I love to look at things that are unique and things that are odd. And as you read Mark chapter 7 and Mark chapter 8, there are some things there that kind of jump off the page as being odd or unique, and you'll see what I talk about as we move through this lesson together today. Our subject matter, do you know Jesus? And if I were to ask you that question and ask you to raise your hands, which I'm not, but if I were to ask you to, I think everyone in here would raise their hand and say, yeah, I know Jesus. And so what does that mean to know Jesus? From a denominational standpoint, probably would mean something different, but we're not going to go there. What I want us to think about this morning is, do we know Jesus in the sense that maybe you know your children, or you know your spouse, or you know your parents, or you know your siblings? You go sit down at a restaurant and you could almost order your meal for your children or for your spouse because you know them that well. You know that they would want to drink this. You know they would want to order this. You know that they don't like these sides. You know you could order for them because you know them that well. Imagine being the apostles in the book of Mark or in the Gospels of Jesus, that they spent time traveling with him, sharing meals with him, spending the night in various locations, and then traveling and working and teaching and doing miracles. They would have known Jesus very well as a very good friend. So the question I have for us is, do we know Jesus that way? Now, we haven't traveled with him, we haven't eaten meals with him, we haven't lodged with him, we haven't done those sort of things in a physical sense like the apostles would have. But the question I want us to pose, and we'll keep kind of circulating back to this, is, do we know Jesus or do we know about Jesus? Because there's a big difference in those two things. Notice what Paul says in Philippians chapter 3. I count everything as a loss for the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness that comes from the law, but one that comes through faith, the righteousness from God that depends on faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, and may share in the sufferings, becoming like him in his death. If you were to read this entire chapter, Paul will talk about all the things he's accomplished, all the great things that he has done. He was a great leader of the Jews. He was a Pharisee. He was very devout in his persecution of Christians. But he says, all of these things that I have obtained, I count them, verse 8, as being rubbish, as being garbage. That's a word that literally talks about things that we would take and have no use for them at all, to throw them away. It's not just like, well, this might have a purpose, but I don't think I need it, I'm going to pass it on. I mean, these things are absolute rubbish and garbage and useless. And all those things that Paul at one time would have been so proud of, he said, I count them as totally useless when it compares to me knowing Christ, for having Christ to be a part of my life. And I do that by having faith and coming to know faith. This past spring, we went to St. Louis and spent a weekend there. Got to go up in the arch. And if I were to ask you how tall is the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, you probably very quickly could Google that, or if you could read the sign beside Henry there, you'd see that it's 630 feet. Right? That's an easy Google search, easy answer, 630 feet. Imagine if I ask you that question again tomorrow. How tall is the arch? Some of us might remember, I think it's 600 something feet. I just looked that up, but I can't remember. What about a week from now if I ask you? Well, I remember looking it up, but I don't remember the exact number. I can look it up again, right? And so we know the facts because we find them so quickly available to us on the internet. Imagine if I asked that question to some of the men and women who helped build the ark in the 1960s. The arch in the 1960s. How tall is the arch? They wouldn't have to Google it, would they? They would know the answer. Not because they had looked it up at one time and memorized it, but because the arch was a part of their life. They built it. They were there. They clocked in and clocked out every day. For a portion of some time of their life, for a couple years, the arch was their life. It was their livelihood. They spent all their hours working on it. And so it wasn't just a Google fact. For them, it was part of their life. And so as we think about Christ, I wonder, do we know the facts or do we know Christ? We probably all could quote some scripture about Jesus. We probably could quote John 3:16. We could quote, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You probably could list off the apostles. Maybe you have to sing them, but you could probably share the apostles with me. You could share with me the events of maybe the crucifixion and maybe the nativity story, the birth story. We know the facts. But have we lived them? Are they our life, or are they just something that we've kind of looked up and checked in from time to time? So do we know Jesus, or do we just know about Jesus? That's what I love about Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel is quick and to the point. We noticed that yesterday. But Mark wants you to know Christ. And he does that by using some very interesting wording. And like I said, I don't want to get too technical as we do this, but as we look at words and examine words, I think all of us understand that the Bible wasn't written in English, that the Bible was written in Greek. Jesus spoke Aramaic. And so we have some different languages, which is why we have different translations. It's why some translations interpret one word this way and one another. It's not that they have an agenda necessarily. It's just that we're trying to find the best way to put Christ's words or the words of the Bible in a way that we can read them and understand them. Words are important. And as Mark uses these words, he uses them in very interesting ways. One thing to notice as we begin is that Mark uses the exact expressions of Jesus more than any other gospel author. And I'll share with you what I'm talking about that as if we were to read our Bibles in Greek, these words would still be in Aramaic. And as we read our Bibles in English, the words are still in Aramaic, okay? And we'll come back to that. But notice all of these. Let's read our text from Mark chapter 7 and see if you can spot. I'm sure you'll be able to spot the word I'm talking about as we read Mark 7, starting in verse 31. Then he, that is Jesus, returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue, and looked up to heaven, and sighed, and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one, but the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. He has made the deaf hear, and the mute to speak. As we read that text, my mind focuses on verse 34. If Jesus says, be opened, then why does Mark give us the Aramaic verse first? Why does he include the real word of Jesus and then translate it for us in that same verse? Well, Mark does that a lot. He does that often because maybe he wants us to feel the moment. He wants us to put ourselves there. He wants us to stop just reading the words, but to really stop and think about what that might have meant, what that might have sounded like, to be in these places. We look throughout the Gospel of Mark, all the way back in chapter 3, when he's calling his disciples, he appointed the 12, Simon, he gave the name Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother James, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name, however you say that, Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. Now, the other Gospels don't give us that word. They just say James and John are the sons of thunder. But Mark gives us this word. He gives us this Aramaic word. Chapter 5, taking her by the hand, we noticed this the other day, he said, Talitha kumi. That is, little girl, I say to you, arise. It's interesting that he doesn't just give us, little girl, arise. He says, Talitha kumi, the Aramaic saying of Jesus. Now, I chase rabbits, and I'm sorry for doing that. Mark chapter 5, when Jesus says that, it's interesting because if you go to the book of Acts and you have a lady named Dorcas, her other name is what in the book of Acts? What was it? Tabitha. What happens to Tabitha in the book of Acts? Remember? She dies, and Peter comes and raises her back to life. If you notice that instance in the life of Peter, and you notice this instance in the life of Jesus, the settings and the sayings are almost identical. Jesus in Mark 5 puts everybody outside of the room except for James and John and who? Peter. Peter, James, and John are the only people, along with the little girl's parents, who come into the room. He takes her by the hand and he says, Talitha Kumi. You compare that to the book of Acts. Peter puts everybody outside, takes Tabitha by the hand, and doesn't say Talitha Kumi. He says Tabitha Kumi. Tabitha, arise. When Peter is faced with a situation that he's never been in before, he does the exact same thing Jesus did. Puts everybody outside, even says the exact same things. Of course, he doesn't say Talitha, he says Tabitha, very similar in the way that they sound. I just think that's interesting that as far as reading the book of Acts, Peter has never raised anybody from the dead yet. So he's in kind of a new situation here. And Peter, what do you do when you've been in a situation you don't know what to do? I do the same thing Jesus did. I remember what Jesus did, and if I can just do what Jesus did, it'll help me get through that. I think that's an interesting phrase there in Mark chapter 5. Then we have in Mark chapter 7, these Pharisees, these religious leaders, were pronouncing this thing called Corban, that is given to God, so that they would not have to have their money to use to help their parents or to help those that were aging or in need. But he says, oh, this money is given to God. It's dedicated to God. And so, sorry, I can't buy you a meal. I'm sorry I can't buy you housing because this money is considered Corban. Corban is an Aramaic word, which means given to God. And then the passage we looked at just a while ago, Ephphatha, that is, be opened, another Aramaic expression that's here. Some of these other ones you will know. You may not have realized they're Aramaic, but his prayer in the garden, Abba, Father, if all things are possible, remove this cup from me. That phrase, Abba, is not a band. I guess it is a band, but it's a phrase that means Father in Aramaic, okay? And so Mark doesn't just say Father, Father. He gives us Jesus' real words on the cross or at the cross. They bring him to Golgotha, which is place of the skull. If you've noticed all of these passages so far, Mark gives us the word and then interprets it for us. Golgotha, which means, by the way, place of the skull. Well, Mark, just put place of the skull. No. I want you to feel the moment. I want you to be in the prayer in the garden as Jesus is pouring out his heart. I want you to hear him call Abba, a word literally meaning not just father, but daddy, as if a 2 or 3 year old is crying out, Daddy, save me, pick me up, I'm uncomfortable here, I'm scared here, I don't like this, help me, I've fallen and scraped my knee, Daddy. And so Mark wants us to feel that, to be in the garden, to express those moments, to go to Golgotha, the place of the skull, to hear Jesus say on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so it's just interesting to me that as you read the Bible, and especially as you read Mark, you notice how many times there are words there we don't know what they mean. But Mark gives us the interpretation of those because he wants us to be in the room in which a little girl comes back from the dead. He wants to be in the garden as Jesus is praying to the Father. He wants us to stand beside the cross and hear Jesus call upon his God. He wants us to feel that moment by using words that catch our attention. Words that we don't understand what they mean, but Mark gives us what they mean. He's not leaving us in the dark. He helps us to understand it, but he uses phrases like this to help us be in the moment. I just think that's interesting to me that Mark uses these words so often. You're there still in Mark chapter 7, and if you are, you've noticed that Mark also quotes the Old Testament in an interesting way. This doesn't jump off the page to you as the other phrase would have, but if you look there in verse 32, here it is on the screen, they brought to him a deaf man who had a speech impediment. Now that word speech impediment is this word here, maglalon. Now I'm not expecting you to know that or to memorize that, but maglalon is used nowhere else in the New Testament. Okay? We have words like agape and phileo. We know what those words mean. Those means love, and they're used multiple times in the New Testament. We read the majority of the New Testament books, and they use those words. There are all sorts of words that are very common, but this word for speech impediment is not used anywhere else. And so if we were not reading this in English, but if we were reading this in the Greek, as the original readers would have read it, that word would have jumped off the screen and jumped off the pages at us. Maglalon, that's a weird word. We don't use that word a lot. Why? There's a lot of other words to describe a speech impediment, and those other words are used in the Bible. Mark, why did you choose to use that word? Well, maybe because Mark is quoting the Old Testament Greek, the Septuagint, from Isaiah. The eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears and the deaf unstopped, and the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. That word mute in the Old Testament Greek is maglalon. The only place in the Bible that it's found is here and in Mark. And so as Mark uses a really weird word, for those folks who knew the Bible and knew the Scriptures, when they read that, their mind goes back to the Old Testament and says, oh yeah, we've been waiting on this guy. We've been waiting on the blind to see and the deaf to hear and the lame to walk and the mute, the speech impediments to sing for joy. And so these words are it's not just Mark sending a text message casually sending something. He's intentional with the way he writes. He's thoughtful in the way that he does things. He's trying to get you not to just read a Bible reading so that you can say, yep, I read my Bible today, check, I'm done with that. He wants us to dive in and to see Jesus and to know Jesus and to not just know the facts about Jesus, but to really get to know Jesus. And he does that also in the last verse of this chapter, verse 37, by highlighting the magnitude of Christ's work. Notice verse 37, after this deaf man can now hear and he can now speak, and the more Jesus tells people don't talk about this, the more they want to talk about that. Maybe that ought to be a lesson for our life. Also, if Jesus has changed our life and if he's made a difference in our life, then people can't stop us from talking about it. And the more that the world tries to stop us, the more zealously we ought to proclaim it, verse 36. But you notice verse 37, they were astonished beyond measure and says, he has done all things well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Notice that phrase, he's done all things well. And that phrase is very similar. The wording of that is very similar to several other times in the Bible that has been said about God. It's been said about the fact that he has done all things well. Is true of his creation back in Genesis. Remember, God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. He had done all things well when it came to his creation. It's also true not only of the Lord's creation, but also true of his revelation. Right? The book of Psalms, the Lord is good. The Lord has done all things well. His steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. These are the same words that Mark is using in Mark 7:37. It's true of the Lord's creation. It's true of his revelation. It's also true of his redemption. The passage that we just read has done all things well. Mark chapter 7, verse 37. And lastly, it's true of Christ's glorification. The book of Titus says, show yourself to be a model of good works. When people look at you, they see that you do all things well. Who gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness, to purify for himself a people of his own possession, who are zealous for good works. People who are eager and zealous to do all things well. And so I love that depiction of this phrase, that Jesus has done all things well. It reminds us of creation all the way back in Genesis, and it points forward all the way to the end of the Christian's job to do all things well. Of creation, revelation, redemption, and glorification. All those wonderful things that Mark points there. If Christ has changed our life, we don't just know about him, but we know him. And the more that people tell us not to talk about this, the more we want to talk about it. Anything you want to add to that? I'm sorry, that's technical. And I'm sorry we're looking at languages that I don't know all that well, and maybe we don't know all that well. But I think that those words just help us to see the heart of Mark. We're going to look at two more hearts of Jesus, or moments from the life of Jesus that help us to really get to know his character. But before we move, you have anything you'd like to add, or comments, or questions, or smart remarks so far? Yes, sir.
I think it's interesting that word magilalo.
Yeah.
Laleo was the Greek word for tongue speaking.
Okay.
Well, he had a great amount
Okay, yeah.
So we know that tongue speaking as we hear it today is just gibberish.
Yeah.
So this is apparently the man's problem.
Yeah, of some ability to not be able to get his words to be in a way that was understandable. Yeah, maybe like a toddler speaking. They're talking, you don't have a clue what they're saying. Yeah, good. What else would you like to add? Appreciate that. All right, let's continue to think about this. So we noticed that a while ago. Let's think about the heart of Jesus here, because here's another word that sticks out in my mind. Verse 34, we just read this. And looking up to heaven, he sighed. You ever notice that about Jesus? That he sighed and he said, Epaphatha, that is, be opened. That when this deaf man with this speech impediment is brought to Jesus, Jesus looked up to heaven and you ever sigh? No, we don't ever sigh, do we? Someone asks us to do something. Maybe that's a more accurate representation. The reason why that word sigh catches my attention is because it only appears twice in the life of Jesus, and they're in back-to-back chapters. Chapter 7, verse 34. And then if you're a daily Bible reader and you're reading chapter 7 and chapter 8 together, as you jump over to chapter 8, you see Jesus do that same thing again. Chapter 8, verse 11, the Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. Jesus sighs twice in back-to-back chapters in just a matter of a few verses. And we don't see Jesus do that any other time in the book of Mark, but here he does twice. Why do we sigh? What are some reasons that we sigh for? Okay, we're frustrated about something. I have tried 100 times to get this little piece of thread through that needle, and I cannot get it to finally go through there. Right? It just gets so frustrated. Good. Why else do we sigh? Okay, we're annoyed or we're angry about something, or something has, we have our last nerve and a semi-truck ran over it, right? I mean, we are just done. And do not touch me, do not talk to me. I have been touched out and talked out today. Some mamas with young folks know how that goes. Why else do we sigh?
It's a physical release of a mental emotion.
Okay, it's built up things inside of my mind, and I'm just a way of releasing that without punching through the drywall. I can just sigh, right, and kind of release that. Good. What else?
Maybe it's better than saying something you shouldn't say.
Okay, yeah, so it's a response of, or maybe you're right, that there's something maybe I shouldn't say, or maybe something I need to bite my tongue, and so I sigh instead. Or maybe sighing is a natural response when I don't have the words, right? When I can't find the adequate words, or if I'm going to say the wrong words, it just kind of takes my breath away, right? What were you going to say?
Sometimes it's when we have gone through something again and again. Jesus has been with these people.
Yeah.
And he knows them, and he knows what he's told them already. And here they are asking the same thing again.
Yeah.
But when you talk about being frustrated, we have a funny experience with one of our friends. We overheard her say to her children, I've told you 1,000,000 times to stop exaggerating.
yeah, I've told you 1,000,000 times, stop exaggerating. Yeah, that's good. That's good. None of our women relate to this, do you? You've told your husband, hey, this Saturday we're having lunch with Mom. Hey, this Saturday we're having lunch with Mom. And then Friday rolls around. We got anything going on tomorrow? I have told you this already. That's kind of Jesus' words here with the Pharisees. I've told you these things so many times before and you don't get it. And so we have this kind of anger, frustration, tiresome attitude. But we also, you go back to chapter 7, you see that we sigh also out of empathy or sadness. You get a phone call that there's been a wreck. A gasp, a sigh. You have a sense of relief. Hey, there was a car wreck, but we made it right through it. Oh, good. I'm thankful for that. And so you see the heart of Jesus sighing in chapter 7 and chapter 8, but it's for two completely different reasons. Okay? Notice this in Romans chapter 8. Paul talks about this as well. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that's to be revealed in us. For creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself might be set free from the bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We're waiting for our sufferings to be over. We're waiting for our bondage to be over. We're waiting for corruption to end. We know that the whole creation has been groaning together. That's the same word, sighing, groaning together in pains of childbirth till now. We deal with this world that causes us to sigh and groan and deal with these things, and we're waiting for that day to finally be over. He says it again later. We are the first fruits of the Spirit. We groan inwardly as we wait for that adoption. And there are times in which we don't know how to pray in this world that we find all these problems in. But the Spirit helps us with groanings too deep for words, right? The Spirit helps us in our prayer life. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 talks about this as well. That this tent, our earthly home's destroyed. We have a building from God, heaven, a house not made with hands. This tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling. And some of you know that maybe more than others. That, boy, I deal with a lot of problems here, and I can't wait till I'm there. I can't wait till I join my loved ones in heaven. For while we're still in this tent, we groan. We are burdened. And so that word is used to describe our sighing. That we are dealing with a broken, fallen world, and we can't wait till we get to heaven where those things are done away with. And so in chapter 7, we see the heart of Jesus sigh out of sorrow because he has compassion for people that hurt. He cares about people that are dealing with heartaches and people that are dealing with all sorts of problems. And we see the Gospels highlight that. I think it's especially the Gospel of Luke that you see Jesus spend a lot of time with outcasts. People that are poor, people that have all sorts of illnesses like leprosy and would have been kicked out of their towns, people that were from different backgrounds like Samaritans, even women in that day and time. Why are you sitting at a well talking with a woman in the book of John? That wasn't common culture. But Jesus cared for people that were marginalized. He cared for people that were the outcast. He cared for people that were hurting. And that's the case of Mark chapter 7. Here's a man that is deaf and been able to speak for some time. And Jesus, his heart is broken for him. And he sighs out of compassion. He looks to heaven. It's almost as if he says, God, how long can we let these people hurt like this? And as we have the tragedies that happen seemingly almost every day and week in our country, I imagine that Jesus has that same mentality. Man, people are hurting. And we need the church to be the hands and feet of Jesus, to help people that hurt, to reach out to people that are dealing with hardship. This young man's name is Christopher Searcy. He was playing basketball with his friends in Chicago when somebody came by and fired a gun across the court. It hit Christopher in the chest. His friends rushed him to Ravenswood Hospital. That's the picture there in the screen. And they got him right outside the hospital at the bottom of those steps, but could not get him up any further. And they ran inside to get medical attention, doctors or nurses, or come help us. My friend has been shot. And the doctors quickly told them, no, we have a policy that we don't treat anybody outside the hospital. That if someone needs medical attention, they have to be inside the doors of this building. Finally, they get a security guard to help them pick their friend up, bring him into the emergency room, and he dies there before medical attention can really be given to him. And so I wonder, we look at that and we are amazed by that. The hospital has since changed a lot of policies and had to pay quite a bit of money because of that. Do we have that same mentality in the church, though? That we only help and care for people inside this building? No, we wouldn't say that. Right, we wouldn't say, oh, no, we care for people outside the building. But what do we do for them? What do we do for those folks, right? It's easy to sit and say, oh, yeah, we will do all these. But what are we doing? It's easy to love and care and send casseroles and go visit folks that are inside the building. What about the folks outside the building? And that's the life of Jesus. Jesus came not to just care about the folks that were in his inner circle, but those that were marginalized on the outside, those people that were hurting. Jesus had compassion for them. And then in chapter 8, Jesus doesn't sigh because of sorrow, but he sighs because of sin. Not because people are hurting, but because people are doubting. not out of compassion, but out of frustration. And those are some of the thoughts that you shared a while ago dealing with that sort of topic. And so these Pharisees have come and they've asked, hey, Jesus, will you give us a sign to show us that you're from heaven? And if we had read this in consecutive order, what had Jesus done at the start of chapter 8? If your Bible has a heading there, what's the beginning of chapter 8? Yeah, Jesus just took a small amount of food and fed 4,000 people with it. I mean, one of the greatest miracles Jesus does, and then these guys come walking up. Oh, hey, Jesus, can you prove you're from heaven? What did I just do, right? What was this miracle all about? If I wasn't showing that I am the Son of God, I have shown you multiple times. I just fed these thousands of people. I just healed a deaf man. Back in chapter 6, I just walked on the water. I mean, I have done sign and sign and sign. Again, I'm not a magic show. I mean, Jesus isn't a guy that sets up on the street corner with a bucket or a hat asking for tips and says, let me do miracles and tricks for you. Okay, the Pharisees have come and asked for this sign, and Jesus says, no, I'm not. That's not how we will operate here. You have faith because you want to believe in me. You're not asking for signs because you're trying to test me or try to tempt me or to try to trap me. Jesus, in Luke chapter 7, answered them, go and tell John what you've seen and heard. Remember, John has been arrested, and he sends his apostles or his disciples and said, hey, is this the guy we're looking for, or should we wait for another? Jesus says, go tell John what you've seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news preached to them. Bless the one who is not offended by me. Hey, I have shown myself to be the Christ. And John and John's followers would take those things to be good enough. The Pharisees would never have good enough. And here's another phrase in Exodus chapter 2, that when God's people in Israel were in slavery in Egypt, God saw the groaning of their people, God heard their groaning, and God remembered them. And so, just like we go back to Romans chapter 8, as we are dealing with a world that causes us to groan, remember that God sees us and God remembers us. That we're not out here dealing with these problems by ourselves, but God knows and God sees. And so before we transition to the last thing that I want us to think about this morning, what is the reason God sighs because of us? Does God sigh because he says, that's my child and I want to help them? Or does God sigh because, boy, that person's really frustrating me with the way they live? Maybe that's something for us to personally think about. Why do we make Jesus sigh? Is he sighing out of frustration, or is he sighing out of compassion? God sees the sighs of his children, and he remembers them. One more thing to think about knowing Jesus, and that is that Jesus offers hope. We turn over to Mark chapter 10. I hate that we're having to kind of skip around because the book of Mark is so full of things, but we only had 4-day classes, and you didn't want to be here 4 hours every day. So Mark chapter 10, let's notice the last part of this chapter as Jesus heals a blind man named Bartimaeus. Let's read the text. Mark 10, verse 46 beginning. They came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples, a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he had heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, call him. And they called the blind man, saying to him, take heart, get up, he's calling you. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you? The blind man said to him, Rabbi, that is, teacher, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. The healing of Bartimaeus really shows us the heart of Jesus. Jesus offering someone hope in a hopeless situation. And so as we think about our lesson today, do we know Jesus or do we just know about Jesus? Knowing Jesus and having a relationship with Jesus is the only way that we have hope. The only thing that gives us hope beyond this life. As you look at Mark 10, there's two important things to know. Number one, realize that blindness is very common in the days of Jesus. I see several of you in here that are wearing glasses or contacts or maybe have had LASIK surgery or cataract surgery before. Imagine living in the days of Jesus when you don't have glasses, you don't have eye doctors, you don't have cataract surgeries, you don't have contacts. I won't ask for a show of hands, but maybe some of you in here might be considered blind if you didn't have your glasses, or if you had not had some sort of corrective eye surgery in the past. That some of you rely very much, and I'm not saying just you, a lot of our world relies a whole lot on glasses. And if you were at our youth rally Saturday, we talked about that our eyes are the second most complex organ in our body behind our brain. Has over 2 million working parts in our eyes. And so it makes sense that we would have maybe some problems with our eyes as we age or as we deal with things in our world because it's so complex. I say that to say blindness is very common in the days of Jesus. No glasses, no contacts. Imagine getting a little piece of dust in your eye and you just take some little eye drops and wash it right out. Well, you can't go to Dollar General and get that. Okay, they don't have one in Jericho. All right, and so people would go blind quite often. Blindness, and it may not be pitch black darkness, but it might be that we can't see things. Remember the one blind man that Jesus heals? I see people walking around like trees, and so maybe his blindness was not pitch black blindness, but he had eye condition that didn't allow him to see things properly, and by definition he would be considered blind by some degree. So people had eye problems frequently, which is why you see a lot of Jesus' miracles, including the healing of the blind. When these people bring groups of people to Jesus, it oftentimes calls them the blind and deaf because so many people dealt with that. Also, Jericho, which if you notice verse 46, that's where we are. Jericho was a city known for blindness, because in the city of Jericho grew this plant. It's a plant called a balsam bush, and these fruits of this, the leaves of this, were used to make an eye salve or an ointment that would in some ways help people who had eye conditions. It would be very similar to eye drops or some sort of medication that you might could get from an eye doctor. This would be a very natural approach to that, very primitive approach that they had in the days of Jesus. And so this plant grew in this area of Jericho. So I'm not exaggerating when I say this, but many commentators believe that hundreds of blind people came to Jerusalem hoping to find a cure for their condition. Because it wasn't that they were born completely blind. They had an accident, they aged, and as they got older, they could not see as well. And they were hoping that, hey, maybe this might be the cure for me. And so we don't know this to be the fact. But it could be that Bartimaeus has no hope of ever seeing again. And he travels to Jericho, this being his last hope. If I get there, maybe this ointment will make me see again. He walks into town. He tries it, and it doesn't work. And so I'm not going to make the journey back home. I'm just going to, verse 46, sit on the roadside here and ask for money. Maybe people have compassion on me because I've traveled all the way to Jericho and I tried the doctors here and the ointment here and it didn't work for me. And I'm hopeless. And he's hopeless until Jesus walks by. That for Bartimaeus, Jesus literally is his only hope of seeing. There are no more doctors. There are no more cities. There are no more ointments. There are no more medicine. Jesus is it. That's all I've got. And so it's with that in mind that we see this man that is without hope. And when Jesus walks by, you see the desperation he goes to get Jesus' attention. Let's read it again, verse 47. When he heard it was Jesus, he began to cry out and said, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And people beside him, in verse 48, they rebuked him. They said, hey, be quiet, be quiet. But he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. That Bartimaeus is getting Jesus' attention because he has no more hope. And you tell me to be quiet, but I can't because this is my only shot at seeing again. It's my only hope of getting this fixed. And, you know, there are movies and books that are like that in nature, in which you've got a parent that's got a child that's hurting, and, oh, I'm sorry that we've closed our doors. We're not taking any more in. No, you've got to. You've got to make an exception. This is my daughter. We've got to get her in. You know, and that's that sense of desperation. I think about the Statue of Liberty. those immigrants that were leaving whatever behind in Europe. Maybe it was religious things, maybe it was a poor financial situation, and they had heard of a place called America, and they had heard of the hope that was here, and they had heard of jobs and freedom, and they jump on a boat with their family and whatever they can put in a suitcase, and they travel across the ocean, not on a plane, on a boat. How long would that have taken? And then you could imagine that morning when they're standing on the edge of that boat, looking off in the distance, and they finally see that. A beacon of hope. That I'm finally making my way across the ocean, and I finally see a lady showing me freedom. And I check into Ellis Island and go through all the things, and then I'm taken to the city, and wow, I'm free. A symbol of hope is what the Statue of Liberty was for so many immigrants who came into Ellis Island, and Jesus is that picture of hope. You see that phrase, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Bartimaeus doesn't come to Christ and throw a pity party. He doesn't come and say, Jesus, let me tell you about how bad I've been. Let me tell you about how sick I've been. Let me tell you when I was in the hospital last. Let me tell you about all these things. I just want mercy. I just want mercy. And maybe that ought to be our prayer. Not coming to God saying, God, let me tell you about all the things I've done for you. Let me tell you about how bad I've had it. God, I want mercy. I just want your love. I just want your mercy. And then you notice that phrase, take heart, get up. He's calling you. Tristan, here's your sermon to preach when you get back to Henderson, your 3-point sermon. Take heart, get up. He's calling you. It takes the right attitude. It takes the right action. And it takes the right approach. All right? It takes this right attitude of having this sort of approach that comes to Christ, that initial step, that Christ's arms are always open. We are the ones going to Him. Jesus has already come to us. He's already come to the world and died on the cross, and His arms are waiting there for us like the Father and the prodigal Son. We are the ones that come to Him now. Christ has done His part. We have the right attitude to go to Him. And then the action, that get up, that phrase that was literal for Bartimaeus to get up off the ground and to go to Jesus. Maybe that's a more spiritual action for us. Coming to Christ in faith. A lot of times Jesus will ask people to do something. Go wash in a pool. Stretch out your hand. Take this mud and put upon your eyes. It wasn't necessarily that the water was magical or the mud on the eye was magical or anything like that. Jesus was asking people, are you willing to do what I'm asking you to do? Are you willing to go wash? Are you willing to stick out your hand? Are you willing to get up? Are you willing to take up your bed and walk? That all of those things, while they were showing the power of Christ through a miracle, they also were testing people's faith. Are you willing to do what I'm asking you to do? Are you willing to take the right actions? And then finally, that approach. He is calling you. That as Bartimaeus walks to Christ, he doesn't walk doubting, but he knows Jesus is calling me and He will make a difference. There is no doubt that when I come to Him, my life will be made right. And then the last phrase, go your way, your faith has made you well. I love this fact that faith was determined. He cried out all the more. His faith had knowledge that he called Jesus the Son of David, that Jesus wasn't just some random guy, but he had heard of Jesus and studied of Jesus and knew Jesus' connection to the Old Testament. It was a faith that was humble. I want you to have mercy on me. A faith that was submissive. He looked at Jesus as being teacher. He said rabbi or rabboni. All right, he didn't come and see Jesus as being his equal, but saw Jesus as being much better than him. And a faith that followed Jesus. After this moment gives Bartimaeus his sight, he followed Him on the way. Right? Bartimaeus continued to go with our Lord. I love this in John 14. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except for me. And you compare that to Mark 10. Jesus says, Bartimaeus, go your way. Your faith has made you well. And immediately he followed Him on the way. That, hey, Bartimaeus, go on. I've made you better. Go your way. And what's Bartimaeus' way? Jesus. I'm following Jesus. Jesus has become my way. I'm not going the way I want to go, but I'm following Jesus. Jesus becomes my way. We'll close with this. There it is. Bartimaeus made Jesus his way. We'll close by talking about this guy. His name's Nigel Richards. I love using this illustration. I think it's pretty powerful. Nigel Richards is a smart guy because, as you can see from his t-shirt, he is the National Scrabble Champion. If you know Scrabble, it's this little board game in which you have the letter tiles, And you then have to take the random tiles you have been given and spell out words on the board. And the bigger words you use, the more odd letters you use, the more points you get. A Q is worth more than an A, right? Maybe you've played Scrabble before. Well, Nigel Richards is impressive because he has won multiple champions at this. I mean, when I play Scrabble, I play words like cat, and the. He spells really impressive words in the way that he does it. Well, what makes Nigel really impressive is the fact that he recently won the French Scrabble Championship, but he doesn't speak French. How did Nigel Richards win the French National Championship? He memorized the French dictionary. Now, talk about something to put you to sleep at night, right? Try to memorize the French dictionary. So as you think about Nigel Richards, he knew the letters, and he knew what order they went in, but he didn't know what they meant. You give him letters, and he can spell something in French. He has no idea what he spelled. He doesn't know French, but he knows the orders of the letters. I'm wondering if we know the order of the letters and don't know what they mean. Do we know the names of the apostles? Do we know the scriptures to quote them and not know the man behind the scriptures? If we're careful, we look at the Bible as a big game of Scrabble. That as long as I know the facts and I can sing the songs at VBS and I can get the answers right in Bible class and I've got it all figured out, and boy, I may know the words and miss the man that gave us the words. That's our challenge, to really know Jesus and not just know about him. Mark's gospel helps us do that in a pretty impressive and amazing way. And I appreciate your attention. Sorry we went a little longer today than we have in time past. I'll make that up to you tomorrow, right? Let's pray together. Father in heaven, we're thankful for this morning. We're thankful for the rain. We're thankful for the sunshine in the hearts of these people here. We're thankful for their dedication to study your word and their willingness to be here as we study. Thankful for the Bible. Thankful for faithful men like Mark who help us to understand the heart of Jesus and help us to do that. Help us to develop a relationship with him and to not just look at these as black letters on white paper, but help us to look at the Bible as something that can change our life. We're so thankful for all that you do for us and the ways you bless us. We praise these things in the name of Jesus, and amen.